jobs. And in the extended family, they were among the few people who did have jobs.
So your father came to America as the beacon of liberty, to live the American dream. Is America still the beacon of liberty?
Well, most of the immigrants who came to the United States did not come to it because it was the beacon of liberty, but because the streets were paved with gold. In fact, a very substantial percentage of the Eastern and Southern European immigrants who came in this huge wave in the early 20th century, and many of them just wanted to go home. They wanted to come here, work hard, and make a lot of money, go home and live like civilized human beings back in Europe. So make enough money to buy a villa and a little home in Greece or Italy and then live a civilized life. They didn't regard American life as a civilized life. It was, and my father came, for them it was different. They were Jewish from Eastern Europe, so yes, they were fleeing from persecution. And the place to come is, of course, America, you know, rich, huge advantages, relatively free from persecution. There was anti-Semitism, in fact, we lived with it, but nothing like the Ukraine, of course, no pogroms and so on. And he came and was, at first worked in a sweatshop in Baltimore, and then sort of worked himself up, managed to get a college degree, and ended up as a teacher. Same with my wife's family.
So he became an expert in Hebraic linguistics?
In Semitic linguistics.
Yeah. Did that arise a spark in you for your interest in linguistics? Was it the example of your father?
It obviously must have been there somewhere, but it wasn't a conscious move from his work to mine. Mm-hmm. The interest was there, yeah.
But you revolutionized linguistics. Chomsky's Revolution in Linguistics, New York Review, 1972. What's the Chomsky Revolution in linguistics?
Headlines tend to be a bit inflammatory.
But still, if I understand right, the backbone of your linguistic theory is that every person is born with an innate faculty for language. Very roughly, in a few words. Is that right? And is that still accepted, or is it contested?
It is contested, but it's a truism. There's nothing to contest. It's everybody's linguistic theory, even those who deny it, because it is literally a truism. I mean, it takes a lot of indoctrination and brainwashing not to perceive it, but simply take, the simplest situation you can think of. Take, say, my granddaughter and her pet kitten or her pet chimpanzee or songbird or whatever. They can be exposed to exactly the same experience, but they react to it very differently. My granddaughter selects out of the complex data around her. She reflexively selects some component of it which is language related. That is not a trivial achievement. We don't know how it's done, but a baby's growing up in what William James called booming, buzzing confusion, and to pick out some piece of that and say, okay, that's language related, is a unique human characteristic, and of course it's done reflexively. Then she also pretty much reflexively picks up the ability that you and I are now using. And of course her pets don't do anything, it's just noise. But either it's a miracle or there's a fixed genetic capacity. There aren't any other choices.
What intrigues me is the link between your linguistic work and thinking and your political thinking.
There is a kind of a family similarity. In both cases, it's based on assumptions about internally generated creative capacities. But there's no inference to be drawn from one to the other. You could have the same linguistic views and be a totalitarian. You could be a libertarian in your political views and believe that be a radical behaviorist.
you're called, the cliché wants you as the American dissident #1. Do you have any real influence? Do you have any real influence in the media, for instance?
Such influence as there is indirect. There's a lot of interaction with, most of what I do is connected with popular movements, organizing, activism, and so on. And that, it's not me. Everyone who's involved in this has a role in changing the nature of the culture and the civilization, which in turn indirectly affects the media.
Some of your critics will say that in your latest book, for instance, you're long on analysis, but short on solutions.
That's a very common and very interesting criticism, because if you look at what I've written, every topic I suggest, there is a solution mentioned. It's just they don't like the solution. So if you don't like the solutions, you can't perceive them. And that was actually a point that Orwell made rather well. His famous essay on nationalism, he describes the nationalist as someone who has a remarkable capacity not to perceive what he doesn't want to believe, either ideas that he doesn't want to think about or atrocities committed by his own side. Can't perceive them.
Speaking about solutions, do you believe in political action? Do you believe in political parties? Do you believe in a third party, for instance, here in America?
There's no general principle about that. It depends on circumstances. Sometimes the right kind of, depending on what you're trying to achieve and what the circumstances are, the right choice of tactics might be political action through one of the existing parties or a third party, or it might be civil disobedience and resistance, or it might be other kinds of organizing. There's no general principle that tells you universally this is the right kind of action to undertake.
Do you feel any affinity to any political party? Are you a Marxist? Do you call yourself an anarchist? Where would you put yourself on the political spectrum?
Actually, a friend of mine, there's a book of essays on my linguistics and philosophical work, critical book of essays, and one of the contributors is a friend. Starts off by complaining that he says the only ism I seem to believe in is truism, which is essentially accurate. Most of what is known about the social, political, economic, cultural world is pretty much on the surface. So we should try to find out the truth about it. I'd be happy with the label anarchist as long as it's properly understood. I mean, anarchism covers a very broad range, but I've always understood it and taken the core fundamental element in it to be simply a tendency in human life and history, which seeks to identify and discern structures of oppression and hierarchy and domination, seek to perceive what Orwell points out we don't see, and challenge their legitimacy. They have to justify themselves. They're not self-justifying. And if they're illegitimate, trying to overcome them. And that, I think, is a permanent condition. So, yes, in that sense, I'd be happy to be called an anarchist. It can go from personal relations, family structures, up to international affairs, and everything in between.
We're in the middle of a financial crisis. What does the crisis teach to you?
The crisis follows from another truism, which has long been understood. There are fundamental market inefficiencies which are built in. One crucial one is what economists put aside as what are called externalities. So if you and I engage in some transaction, say you sell me a car, the two of us might reach a satisfactory outcome for ourselves, but we do not take into account, we do not price the effect on him. Okay, that's not part of our calculation in a market system, but there is an effect on him. More pollution, higher gas prices, congestion, and so on. Now, these so-called externalities can be huge, and in financial systems, they're fundamental. The reason is that risk is underpriced. consistently and as a matter of principle. A financial institution is dedicated to taking risks.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it does. Now, if it's well managed, it takes into account the potential losses to itself. But notice, to itself. It does not take into account what's called systemic risk, the impact on the whole socioeconomic structure if it suffers losses. And those systemic risks can be substantial. What that means is that risk is underpriced, and there's more risk taken than would happen in a properly functioning system. Now that's built into financial markets, and that's why when financial liberalization was instituted in the early 70s, since that time there have been increasing regularity and severity of crises, with the government being forced to step in to try to do something about them. You can't predict the exact moment or scale of a financial crisis, but you can predict that it'll occur as a result of financial liberalization. Now, it just happens that this one is extremely severe due to the religious fanaticism of market fundamentalists who tried to dismantle deregulation with obvious consequences. It's not a new observation. I mean, I guess a number of economists have pointed it out over the years and discussed it.
Would you go with the classic Marxist theory that capitalism lugs from crisis to crisis and that crises are inevitable?
I don't think it's a particularly Marxist theory, but we don't have capitalist systems. We shouldn't be talking about capitalism. They don't exist. What we have are various varieties of state capitalism, and the state component of the economic system is fundamental. Doctrinal extremism tells us to suppress it, but if you think about it for a minute, take, say, the American economy, which is supposedly a free market economy. It's nothing remotely like that. I mean, the advanced economy, the cutting edge of the economy, relies crucially on massive state intervention. Or take the place where we're now sitting, MIT. MIT is right at the heart of the creation of the advanced economy of the future, and it does it on public funds. That's why we have computers and the internet and airplanes and lasers and pharmaceuticals and so on. There's a massive public contribution. The system is based on the principle that the public pays the costs, takes the risks, and profit is privatized. Actually, you see it, it's now in the newspapers because you see it so dramatically in the financial system.
So now even the Republicans say that.
So now everyone says it, but as if it's something new. But it's not something new. It's the way the system works.
What have 8 years of Bush administration done to America?
It's been a harsh blow to American power. I remember in the year 2000, a very well-known radical historian, a very fine one, wrote an article which surprised his friends, me too, in which he said it would be a good idea to vote for Bush because his administration is going to be a body blow against American imperialism, which in fact turned out to be true. In the Bush years, U.S. influence and power in the world has greatly declined. The unpopularity of the United States has sharply increased. Has had a devastating effect on the economy. For the majority of the population, real wages have pretty much stagnated. Benefits have declined, work hours have increased. Consumption increases, but substantially on the basis of borrowing. And this accelerated during the Bush years, which were the worst of the period.
What's his legacy? The war on terror? The war in Iraq?
George Bush did not declare a war on terror on September 11th. He redeclared it, which is a crucial distinction. The Reagan administration, when it came into office 20 years earlier, declared a war on terror. They stated that the core of their foreign policy would be the struggle against international terrorism, the plague of the modern age, a return to barbarism in our time, and so on and so forth. And they carried out what they called a war on terror. Now, this has been wiped out of history for a good reason. their war on terror immediately turned into a vicious, brutal, and murderous terrorist war. And its main target was Central America, where they killed hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed 4 countries. There were other targets, too. In Southern Africa, they were strongly supporting the apartheid state in violation of congressional restrictions. They had a major role not only in its crimes, but in its depredations in the neighboring countries, which killed over 1 million people. As late as 1988, just before the apartheid state fell, the U.S. government declared that Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress were among the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That was the first war on terror. Well, that's best forgotten. That's not good for our self-image. So that's been whitewashed out of history. But that's the war on terror, which Bush redeclared, and not surprisingly, it turned into a violent, aggressive war.
Bush, in his rhetoric, wants to redraw the map of the Middle East, wants to democratize, wants to export democracy. What does that mean to you?
It means exactly as much as it meant when Stalin said that he was in favor of bringing democracy to the world. In fact, if you read we're getting Russian archives, and it's interesting to read the internal records where these thugs are talking to each other and not for the public, they're talking about the need to protect Eastern European democracy, people's democracy, from the fascist forces from the West, and so on and so forth, and they probably believe that they're talking to each other. Yes, it's very easy to talk about promoting democracy. And if you have a very loyal commissar class who simply conform to power unthinkingly, they'll repeat it. On the other hand, if you look at the facts, it's a joke. I mean, even standard scholarship recognizes that the leading scholar of democracy promotion, also an advocate and a Reaganite, is Thomas Carruthers, the most respected. He's done careful work on it. He thinks it's very important. But he does point out, he's an honest scholar, he says every U.S. president has been schizophrenic. They support democracy if and only if it conforms to strategic and economic objectives. Correct. And so did Stalin. Which means, if we're honest, that the whole talk about democracy promotion is a complete fraud. And you can see it in case after case. I'm going to take, say, the Middle East. He wants to democratize the Middle East. There has been one free democratic election in the Middle East, carefully monitored, carefully supervised, namely in the Palestinian territories in January 2006. Free election, everyone agreed, carefully monitored, no fraud, and so on. What was the U.S. reaction to it? Instantly to turn to punishing the population bitterly for voting the wrong way in a free election. Wrong way meaning the way we didn't like. Yeah, that's right. Stalin would have cheered. And he would have been very happy that Western intellectuals call this democracy promotion. I don't want to say that Western intellectuals are comparable to Stalinist commissars. They're much worse. For the Stalinist commissars, they could at least plead fear and extenuation. Western intellectuals can't plead fear, just a subordination to power.
Do you have any hope for the future? Do you have any hope of change in the next elections?
Well, the elections themselves, the political leaders themselves are not going to institute any significant change. But any political leader is going to react to the popular mood and to popular activism. Actually, we just saw an example of that, striking example 2 days ago, when Congress was compelled by a populist rebellion to vote down a stimulus package. But if the public is organized and active, it can create conditions under which any political leader will carry out some constructive actions, otherwise not. About 95% of the public in the most recent polls criticize the government because it pays no attention to public opinion. Now, good, that's a sign of hope. That means that there have been major efforts to depoliticize the country, to atomize people, to separate them from one another so that they don't enter the political arena. But those are not laws of nature. They've been overcome in the past. They're overcome elsewhere. Those are signs of hope.
Most people want better health care, want better education. Still, they vote for parties who do the opposite.
Because they have no choice. See, in fact, if it's the healthcare is a very interesting and illustrative case. For decades, the American healthcare system is a total catastrophe. Has twice the per capita costs of other industrial societies and about the worst outcomes, and people suffer from it. And they think, for decades, the public has been strongly in favor of a national healthcare system. Up until 2004, the election of 2004, this could not enter. In fact, you take a look at the discussion in 2004. It was mentioned that the public's in favor of this, but it was called politically impossible or lacking political support in the New York Times. Only the large majority of the public, but that's not political support. In this election, it's a little different. The Democratic candidates, at least, have put forth programs which are not what the public wants, but are moving in that direction. Well, what changed between 2004 and 2008? Not public opinion, which has always been in favor of it. What changed is that a sector of corporate power, namely the manufacturing industries, are being smashed by the highly inefficient privatized healthcare system. So General Motors said it costs them more than $1,000 to produce a car in Detroit than it does across the border in Windsor, Canada. Well, when a big sector of American capital becomes concerned about something, it becomes politically possible. Now, if we had a free press here and in Europe, and we had honest political commentators, they would point out that this is a devastating critique of the functioning of American democracy. Something that the public wants and is critically important for them becomes politically possible if General Motors wants it. Before that, it wasn't politically possible. Now, that can be overcome, and it's not just on domestic affairs. The same is true internationally. Take probably the major international issue that's on the horizon has to do with Iran. Both political candidates insist that the United States must be a criminal state. It must violate the UN Charter by threatening war against Iran. And they both do it. That's not discussed. That's taken for granted. Everybody must do that. We're an outlaw state. What does the public think? By a large majority, the public's opposed. By a very large majority, the public favors a nuclear-free weapon zone in the region, including Iran and Israel, and any American forces there. Well, that's politically impossible. No political candidate can mention it. The press won't even report it, that the public opinion polls. Okay, these are signs of severe deficiency in American, in fact, Western democracy, but they can be overcome.
Mr. Chomsky, we could go on for hours, but I thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you very much.
De bekroonde film van Eran Riklis, The Syrian Bride, zometeen. Terwijl bijbeldeskundige Geert Dekker het beste van zichzelf geeft even over 11. En op dit moment herbeleef je op Canvas Plus de filmrevolutie uit de jaren